What's up, everybody? My name is Mcgilchrist, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is the most requested guest in the history of the podcast. His name is Dr. Iain Mcgilchrist, and most people know him for having authored The Master and His Emissary, a book about what we popularly refer to as the divided brain and its role in the making of the modern world. His most recent book, The Matter with Things, has been more than a decade in the making, and it explores the deepest, most fundamental questions about the nature of the human experience. This conversation will provide you with a new way of looking at the world that is very different from the one that has largely dominated the West, going at least as far back as the dawn of the European Enlightenment. It is Dr. Mcgilchrist's view that we have systematically misunderstood the nature of reality because we have depended on that aspect of our brains that is most adept at manipulating the world in order to bend it to our purposes. The part of our brains that is most proficient at constructing models or representations of the world and sticking to them, indeed, doubling down on them, even in the face of falsifying evidence. In the conversation that follows, you will learn how the brain is divided into two hemispheres. The left hemisphere, which to sum up a vastly complex matter in a phrase, is designed to help us apprehend the world and thus manipulate, control, and exert power over it. And the right hemisphere, which is designed to help us comprehend the world, to see it for all that it is in its richness, nuance, and glory. The problem, according to Iain, is that the very brain mechanisms which succeed in simplifying the world so as to make it more responsive to our ambitions for power and control have become the primary obstacles to our understanding of it. The consequences of this imbalance can be seen all around us, in our ecosystems, our systems of government, our economies, and within the very fabric of our own societies. The rise of narcissism, paranoia, our obsession with categories and discrete identities, the rise in depression, the policing of language, and the panopticon of surveillance and control are all symptoms, in Iain's eyes, of the tyranny of the left hemisphere made manifest in the world around us. The first hour of our conversation is devoted primarily towards understanding the physiology of the divided brain and how we can recognize what has contributed to our synthesized picture of the world by both hemispheres. In the second hour, which is available to premium subscribers, we examine the various ways in which the dominance of the left hemisphere is manifesting itself upon society, as well as the deeper philosophical questions that have concerned humanity since time immemorial. We look at the stuff of which the cosmos is made: time, space, motion, matter, and consciousness, as well as why we might see it as divine in nature, and its apparently paradoxical nature, a paradox that Iain suggests has generally resulted from the clash between the ways in which the right and left hemispheres construe reality. This was an absolutely wonderful conversation, and despite some of the audio challenges that we dealt with on my end of the microphone, I'm confident that you will walk away from it with a sense of enlightenment and inspiration, and maybe even a new perspective on the world and our place in it. You can find related podcasts to this one on this week's episode page at hiddenforces.io, where you can also access the second part of today's conversation by joining one of our 3 content tiers. This gives you access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the second part of today's conversation on your mobile device, using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this truly inspirational and enlightening conversation with my guest, Dr. Iain Mcgilchrist. Dr. Iain Mcgilchrist, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you very much. Very good to be with you, Dimitri.
It's so wonderful having you on, Dr. Mcgilchrist. I think that you are perhaps the most requested guest I've ever had on Hidden Forces, which is saying something, both because we've had a lot of guests and a lot of requests, but also because our podcast ventures so broadly. It's not focused on one particular area. And so it's so interesting to me, and it has been for a long time because you've been requested so many times, that you have been just so highly requested among all of our different guests. So before we get into today's conversation, which is going to focus on your life's work, both what you talked about in The Master and His Emissary, as well as in The Matter with Things, which is your latest book, your latest tome, actually. Before we do any of that, before we get into this part of the conversation, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about you, how you got interested in these subjects, how you became a physician, and how you came to study what is popularly known as the divided brain.
Yes, okay. I've been probably, like many of your guests, the sort of person who's widely interested in many things all my life. And I started thinking in my teens that many of the things that I was taught to believe couldn't be right, that, the world was inert and unresponsive to me, that the whole was just the same as the sum of the parts, that things moved in straight lines rather than in spirals, as I believe they do, that the intellect's desire to take things singly out of context, categorize them, and pigeonhole them was the way to help understand what was going on. I thought all of these things were rather doubtful. And I went to Oxford and studied literature really from a point of view of the philosophy of literature and wrote a book about it called Against Criticism. Not to say that I'm against criticism in general, but that there seemed to me something wrong with the academic pursuit of analyzing works of literature, in which something that was unique and essentially implicit and embodied became disembodied, explicit, and no longer unique, just generic. And you seem to have destroyed the very qualities you've gone to it for. And so I thought, well, this is something to do with the mind-body relationship. And I went to all the philosophy seminars, but they were just too disembodied in their approach. And I thought that, well, I need to do this in a more embodied way. And it was right around the time that Oliver Sacks, had just written Awakenings. And I thought, wow, this is an amazing book for all sorts of reasons. But what he manages to do is see deep philosophical meaning in what happens when something affects somebody's brain and it affects their whole being. And I thought this is the way to understand this mind-body relationship. So I trained in medicine. There may also be a gene involved because my dad was a doctor and his dad was a doctor. And as far as I remember, they both tried not to become doctors, but in the end did. So rather later than most people, about 10 years on from the normal in this country, 18 when you go to university and study medicine, I started a medical degree. And I then ended up at the Maudsley Hospital in London, which is the psychiatric training centre. They would say the best in the country. And it has a strong neurological arm as well. And I began to get very interested in certain things, particularly after hearing a lecture by a colleague who'd just written a book called The Right Cerebral Hemisphere and Psychiatric Disorders. And I thought, that's interesting, because all I ever hear about is the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere seems to be, well, nobody really knows. Maybe it's just like a bolster to stop the important left hemisphere from falling over. Nobody had any idea what it seemed to do. And I went to a lecture by a colleague, John Cutting, who'd just written this book, and he said that it did certain things that seemed to me very interesting, this right hemisphere. It was able to understand implicit meaning. It saw the unique case, not just the general category, and it saw things in the way that they're embodied and embedded in a context. And this just was like an aha moment for me, because I realized the reason I found my book Against Criticism so hard to write was that I was trying to get the talkative left hemisphere to put across the way of being of the silent right hemisphere. And that led me into doing research on it for, well, the rest of my life, actually. And many people pled with me not to do this. They said, look, you've got a promising career ahead of you. Don't ruin it by looking into this hemisphere differences. Everybody knows that this is just pop psychology. It's all complete nonsense. Anyway, fortunately, I resisted that, because although many of the things that were believed turn out to be wrong, most of them probably, there were still important questions to ask. Why is the brain divided after all? Why on earth would the brain, which effectively is a network that increases its power by the number of connections it can make, why was it divided down the middle? Why was the corpus callosum, the band of fibers at the base of the brain that connects these two hemispheres, so much concerned with inhibition? And why were the two hemispheres asymmetrical? And I went to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore and did some imaging of the brains of subjects with schizophrenia who have abnormal asymmetries in the brain. They don't have the normal asymmetry, many of them. They have either the reversed asymmetry or no asymmetry at all. But you actually need a certain kind of asymmetry in which the left hemisphere famously is broader towards the back, but the right hemisphere is broader towards the front. That one is the most striking, the largest asymmetry in the brain, but it wasn't even mentioned in medical school because nobody could really say what the right hemisphere did. So that was just ignored. And all the emphasis was on this left hemisphere thing. Anyway, so I went on from there, and you know what happened. I spent years writing these enormously long books, but they're very good for people with insomnia.
Right. Well, so there's so much to comment on there. First of all, having read your work, I read The Master and His Emissary. And what I did in the case of The Matter with Things is I watched many of the videos that you have put out online on your channel on YouTube, where you and a fellow interlocutor who interviews you go through chapter by chapter the book. And so I've devoted a lot of time to watching you, hearing your thoughts and reading your words. And you are quite a Renaissance man. I'm curious, before we go on to explore the themes of the book, I'm curious what it was like to go to medical school, not just 10 years later than everybody else, but 10 years after you had devoted yourself to studying something very different than your fellow students had been. I mean, coming with that perspective from literature
Yes.
into the sciences, what was that like?
Hilarious and exhilarating. Since childhood, I've been very interested in science. My father and my grandfather, my mother's father actually was a keen scientist, and so I was all excited about that. But in my teens, I discovered the importance of the humanities, and so spent most of my time until the end of my 20s immersed in history, literature, and philosophy. So it was a huge jump. And the reactions of my fellow students were amazing because they were 10 years younger than me and I was 28 starting. And they were like, oh, so brave of you to do this, like with one foot in the grave. Anyway, I think it actually is very helpful to have done something else before doing medicine. In fact, I quite like the American system that you can't even start medical school until you've got a degree in something, although too often that's in a science, where I think actually for medical school it would be very good if you had a background in philosophy or history. It was exhilarating because all my life I'd been dealing with imponderable problems where there simply was no right and wrong. And then I discovered the beauty of anatomy, which is intrinsically a very beautiful subject. I mean, I remember seeing a head sliced in half and looking inside and seeing the cerebellum. And if you've never seen the cerebellum sliced through, it's exquisitely beautiful. It has this pattern like a forest of trees. And I remember thinking, even an ugly person has one of those in their head. This is great. And the other thing was there were facts, a certain nerve has a certain innervation and you can either get it right or you can get it wrong. So this was great.
So I want to get into your work. The last question I have before we get into the physiology of the brain, because the way I conceptualize this conversation is to begin with the physiology, then move towards a conversation about the social implications of your findings and the manifestation of what you feel is an excessive reliance on left brain-like thinking in the world. Yeah. Or the evidence of a world where people are increasingly using their left hemisphere to navigate it and to conceptualize it and to act upon it and to understand it, perhaps, over-reliance on understanding it. And then the last part would be more of a philosophical conversation about the nature of the world itself. How do we know what we know? What is it possible to know? And what can we know about ourselves? But my last leading question is, has to do with the controversy surrounding this subject and this framing. Why is the pursuit of trying to understand the divided brain, so to speak, so controversial?
Well, it's because it is a very evocative concept. I've since discovered that in most cultures around the world, people have myths that suggest that they intuitively are aware from introspection that their mind is not unitary, but has these two particular kind of often depicted as warring brothers, these or as a general and an emperor, but in other words, a master and his emissary, in fact, that there is one force that needs to be in charge of the other, but these two complementary forces are sometimes in conflict and sometimes work in union. And this therefore got into popular culture because it resonated with people, I think. They thought, yes. But unfortunately, the original answers were based on the typical mode of exploration in science, which is to liken what you're looking at as a machine, first of all, and then to ask the sort of machine questions. So the brain was, quote, obviously a machine. By the way, I utterly refute this idea. There are so many ways in which it's nothing like a machine. Anyway, that idea then led them to ask, so what does it do? Machine do something? And their answer was, well, the left hemisphere does reason and language, and the left hemisphere does pictures and pink fluffy stuff, creativity. And there are some elements of truth in this, but over time, people discovered that, lo and behold, both hemispheres are involved in all of these, and indeed in everything, which is indisputable. So where does that leave it? Well, in my view, bang on track, because the point is, it's not about what they do, but in how they do it. And by that, I don't mean just the means by which they do it, but the manner in which they do it, the standpoint, the disposition from which they do what they do. So both contribute to reason, both contribute to language, both contribute to pictures, both contribute to creativity, but in reliably different ways. And once you've seen that, then the whole picture forms itself, which is quite different from the old one. So the first thing I always have to do is go, yeah, you know already that it's all rubbish about hemisphere differences because the things that were said in the 1970s were wrong. And there was a big outbreak, if you like, of this interest in the 60s and 70s because of the first split brain operations, which were carried out in California. And these were a great step forward in patient care for people who had intractable epilepsy. So they would spend almost their entire time having an ongoing seizure. So they couldn't lead a life. And it was discovered that if you cut the corpus callosum that joins the two halves of the hemisphere, one of the hemispheres may be having the seizure, but the other one doesn't. And with that other one, you can at least get on with a life. So this was fascinating in itself. And there were also stories which got into the public imagination that after this operation, the two halves of the brain seemed to contradict one another. So somebody would go to the cupboard and take out a dress to wear, and her other hand would take it back and put it in the cupboard and pull out something in a different color. So there was a number of interesting ideas here that were very fruitful, but were too quickly collapsed into a simplicity. And what I've had to do is go back and look at a mass of research. And in the new book, The Matter with Things, I refer to about 5,600 pieces of research that bear on hemisphere difference. And nobody can say there's nothing in it. And nobody can say, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
So one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, how do we know what we know about the lateralization of brain function? How much of it is derived from these aberrant cases of either patients with strokes who lost right or left brain hemisphere function? How much of it is in cases of patients that had corpus callostomies, where the corpus callosum was split, like you described, in order to alleviate the symptoms of epilepsy? And how much of it is actually from studying the brain itself in MRI or PET scans and things like this? And how much do they complement one another?
They do complement one another, and it's a mistake to rule any of them out. A lot of our first knowledge about hemisphere differences came from strokes. Famously, Paul Broca, after whom an area in the left frontal lobe where speech is generated, that area is named Broca's area, described in 1860s a case of a man who had a stroke there and suddenly went from being able to speak to only being able to make one sound, tongue. And of course, there were many, many, many others. So you build up a picture that is reliable, that when you have a stroke in this area, something specific happens. When you have a stroke in another area, quite something different happens. So that's one. Then there are ways of, and it's not just strokes, it can be an injury or a tumor or anything of the kind, but these things can reliably tell you that something in the area that's been disrupted has happened in that person's experiential world. That's in itself very important. Then there are, as you say, studies of split brain patients where you can isolate one hemisphere at a time and send pictures to one or the other hemisphere and see what it makes of them. So that was another way. And you can do this with something called dichotic listening, where you put a sound into the speaker in only one ear. And in the human body, all these inputs are crossed over so that the right hemisphere governs the left side of the body and receives messages from it and vice versa. And then there are neuroimaging studies, both the kind fMRI scans where you can inject an isotope and you can see which areas of the brain are active. And then there are EEG studies where you can see the tracing of the electrical activity in the brain. Each of these has different strengths. For example, EEG is extremely accurate for time, but not for space, whereas fMRI is accurate for space, but not for time. And it's also very difficult to interpret. It's probably the least easy to interpret of any of these kinds of data. And now we have the wonderful thing that you can temporarily and painlessly suppress one part of the brain at a time using a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, and you can see what happens. So you can do this experimentally. You can switch off some part of somebody's brain for 15 minutes and then let go and it comes back again. So this is another major step forward. In the past, some studies were done using ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, which of course was a treatment for severe depression. And during that process, for about 20 minutes, the side of the brain that has been treated is hypo-responsive compared with the other side of the brain. So you're tending to get a very one-way lateralized picture of the brain function. So all of these put together help us understand the lateralization in the brain.
And one more point to note for people that might become confused throughout the course of this conversation when we talk about left and right brain versus left and right hand. The function of the brain is contralateralized in this case. So the left part of the brain uses the right side of the body.
Correct.
Can you just explain that a bit so that people aren't confused as we walk through the rest of this conversation?
Well, it's fairly simple. Any output or input from one hemisphere, with very few exceptions, which we can safely ignore for these purposes, goes to the other side of the body. So the left hemisphere is communicating with the right side of the body and the right with the left. And this is true of the eyes and the ears and so on. But it's not. Let me just qualify about the eyes, because in many animals, it is true that the right eye simply feeds to the left hemisphere and vice versa. In humans, it's slightly different because we have eyes on the front of our heads, not on the sides of our head. And so it's the left visual field of each eye, both left and right, that goes to the right hemisphere and vice versa. But that's a small point, really. Yeah.
That was actually the point that I wanted to clarify specifically, because I've heard you talk about that with respect to the eyes. And I know that's not the case, for example, in pigeons, which are used for many of these experiments. So I've heard
they
you
have
say
their eyes on
that,
the side of the head. Yeah.
So I've heard you say that the brain's left hemisphere is designed to help us apprehend the world and thus manipulate, control, and exert power over it. Yeah. And that the right hemisphere is designed to help us comprehend the world, to see it for all that it is and its uniqueness and nuance.
Yeah.
I'd like to spend some time right now discussing each part in detail. Let's start with the left hemisphere. What does the left hemisphere specialize in?
Well, its main speciality we've already referred to, I suppose, is its ability to speak. So I might make a difference between language and speech. Much of language comprehension and language formation goes on in the right hemisphere as well as the left. But for most people, most right-handers at any rate, speech is in the left. Now, somebody who's a listener who's a left-hander will ask, but what about me? And unfortunately, there isn't a quick answer. In people who are left-handers, and by the way, handedness is a comparative thing. It's not an all or nothing thing. So usually people may be right-handed for many things, but left-handed for one or two things, and vice versa. And there's also such a thing as left-eyedness, left-footedness, and left-earedness. So it's a complicated picture, but in people who are more or less left-dominant, the left side of their body is dominant, the left hand is dominant. For them, there are really only three possibilities. Either their brains are very much like the standard right-handed person's brain, or it's just a mirror image, in which case you can just replace everything where I say left by right. Or, and this is much the commonest thing, there is a kind of mix of things going on, which is different in each case and therefore can't be quickly generalized about, but can lead to specific talents or specific deficits. So you tend to find that people who are left-handers are overrepresented at the top of many skill sets and at the bottom. So anyway, I think we've answered the point about, how this is called decussation in the nervous system, and it takes place at the level of the brainstem. So, and there are various theories about why it should have happened, because it seems a little bit odd, but there are a couple of main theories about how that might have come about.
Well, one of the things that I found so interesting about I guess it feels almost weird calling it a framework in the context of this conversation, because frameworks are so left-brained. But let's just say your view is that it feels incredibly intuitive. And once I began to grapple with it, I felt that I could reliably predict what the left brain would do versus the right brain. So one of the, I think, key distinctions is that the left brain deals much more in abstractions, in categories, in bringing structure to the world, coming to the world with what it is and imposing upon it a certain kind of order that allows us to be able to act upon it more efficiently. And as you talk about, to control, to manipulate, to go after, to get. And the right hemisphere, according to your, again, view and theory here, it grapples with the nuances of the world. It seems, for example, that the right hemisphere would look at a bird visiting its window, and it would have a relationship to that bird. It would maybe have a name for it. It would understand it as a particular phenomenon that visits it every day in all of its nuance. Whereas the left part of the brain would see it as, that's a cardinal. I know exactly what it is. I've sort of stereotyped it, identified it, categorized it, and we can move on now. How accurate is that depiction that I've put forward? And I'd like to really begin to work through some of these distinctions, the things that we see in people that are maybe, again, this is maybe not perfect because, like you said, each side of the brain does many things, and we're integrated people with both hemispheres. But maybe for the purposes of this conversation, we can also try to imagine people as though they were more left brain dominant or right brain dominant, and what their worlds would be like.
Yes. Well, if you'll bear with me, what I'll do is I'll explain the roots of this in evolution, what that leads to in terms of the kind of world that each hemisphere subtends or supports, brings into being for us. And then I'll talk about what happens when people are over-reliant, usually for some pathological reason, on one or other hemisphere. So evolutionarily, this is because every living creature has to be able to solve a conundrum, which is how to eat and stay alive at the same time. And that may not sound difficult to us, but it is. It's essentially a problem that all living things have to contend with, because in order to catch food, it has to have a very narrowly focused targeted attention to a detail, which is what it wants to grab quickly. So coming back to the distinction you made earlier about apprehending, which literally means grappling onto, grasping, getting, having power over, manipulating something, it needs to be very clear, very precise, very narrow, and to have an idea it already knows it wants this thing. But if that's the only kind of attention it pays, it will not last very long, because it's also got to have some kind of consciousness that is looking out for the whole picture, looking out for predators, looking out for conspecifics, looking out for the bird's own kin or the animal's own kin. So these two ways of looking at the world are, one, a very, very narrowly targeted beam of attention to a detail, and the other, a broad, open, sustained, vigilant awareness of the whole picture. So that sets the scene. Now, what this means is the kind of way in which these two kinds of attention bring the world to us, widely different. Let me just give you an example. There are different ways of attending to something like a human body, which depend on the circumstances. So, for example, if I'm a pathologist with a dead body on the slab, I attend to it one way. If I'm a lover in bed, I attend to the body with me in a different way. If I'm helping my elderly aunt who's disabled, I attend to her body in a different way. If I'm in an art class, I attend to the model's body in a different way. So how you attend changes what it is you see, and in really quite a radical way. So when you have this narrow beam attention, what you see is a world made up of little tiny bits, of fragments. They're atomistic, they're taken out of context, they have no context, the context has been shorn off. They are somehow abstract and lifeless. They're sitting there, impassive, and are relatively certain. The left hemisphere wants certainty and clarity. Remember, it's trying to get something quickly. So these bits are static little atoms of experience that make no sense on their own. And so the left hemisphere thinks, I've got to make the structure here. I've got to bring to bear a theory about how all this is mechanized. And so you get into the left hemisphere's view, which is a map or a diagram or a theory about how it believes things are structured, which makes it very useful for it to just get stuff. But the right hemisphere sees a completely different picture in which nothing is ever completely separate from anything else. Everything is interconnected. Everything is also flowing and changing all the time. It's never got that stasis that comes from a snapshot. You know, the left hemisphere is taking a quick snapshot, what the French call a cliché, beautifully. And the right hemisphere is seeing this moving, unfolding, ever-changing picture that is interconnected. In that picture, everything is in a context, and it's made what it is by that context. So when you rip it out of the context, you've altered it already. Much of what is expressed, 90% of it, is implicit, not the explicit meaning. And this is true when we're reading or speaking. We're communicating using all kinds of things: the facial expression, the tone of voice, the body posture, irony, sarcasm, metaphor, poetic images, myths, and so on, which are all ways of helping us understand. But the left hemisphere is rather like an autistic dictionary that just says, these are the rules, these are the words, I'll put it together, without any sense of the context in which that thing comes to have meaning. So actually the understanding of what an utterance is in context is more served by the right hemisphere than the left. And there are a few other small differences. So the left hemisphere is more interested in quantity, and the left, which sees individual things with their qualities. But perhaps and there are others, but perhaps the most important one to direct your attention to right now is the difference between something as it becomes present to us through our attention to it. When you're not attending to it, it's not present to you, but it becomes present to you when you attend to it. And the quality of that attention, if it's right, it richly allows that thing to come into being. But the left hemisphere doesn't do this. It takes what the right hemisphere has attended to initially and then abstracts it. And it's dealing with a representation. Now, a representation means literally present again after the fact, when in reality, it is no longer present. So you've got a world of representations which are diagrammatic, abstract, non-emotional, detached, fragmentary, and frankly void of meaning. And another world which is pregnant with meaning, which is rich, which is living and multifarious, and which is always coming into being for us. So that's very different. Now, the third thing I said I would talk about, and there's just so much to say about that, but I'll try and keep it very brief, is in the first part of The Matter with Things, because it's in 3 parts, that book, which is why it's so long. In the first part, I look at the neuroscience of what happens when the right hemisphere or the left hemisphere are damaged. And I look at the ways in which we can get to know stuff about the world before we work on it, but just get that stuff, get the information. And they are, I would say, attention, which I've just talked about, perception, which is not the same as attention, judgments formed on the basis of perception, apprehension, which is the left hemisphere's speciality, what can I do with this, emotional and social intelligence, how do I understand this in a human sense, cognitive intelligence, i.e. the sort of things that are the basis of an IQ test, and creativity, because nothing ever comes giving itself immediately. We have to use a certain degree of creativity to see actually what it is that we're dealing with properly. So to cut things short, what I say in the first 400 pages, and it's ripe with and rich with, I hope, examples of individuals who have suddenly lost a certain function in one or other of the hemispheres. And what I show is that for each of these, except for the grabbing and getting, which is clearly better done by the left hemisphere, the rest is all better done by the right hemisphere. And what this means is that if somebody has a left hemisphere stroke, they often can't speak, they often can't use their right hand, which is for many people their main hand for doing stuff, for writing, for example, or picking up things. And so it's historically been thought of as a huge catastrophe to have a left hemisphere stroke. Much better to have a right hemisphere stroke. But no, the right hemisphere stroke turns out to be far more consequential and is in fact much harder to rehabilitate somebody from than a left hemisphere stroke, despite the fact that that person may not be able to speak or use their right hand. And this is because our ability to make sense of the world, to understand what people are saying, why they're doing what they're doing, what is going on around me, is based on the right hemisphere. And when the left hemisphere is more or less left to itself or overactive and the right hemisphere is underactive, the balance is shifted, it is frankly delusional. And I'm not the only person who said this. There are many accounts, and I can point you to people who have made the same observation. On its own, the left hemisphere is frankly delusional. So the really extraordinary delusions and hallucinations that psychiatrists and neurologists are familiar with, almost all the really vivid ones and the important ones are due to damage to the right hemisphere, not damage to the left. So that just gives you some idea. It's the right hemisphere that grounds us in the world, connects us to others, allows us to feel empathy for others, and allows us to see a big picture and orientate ourselves in it.
So Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor wrote a book called My Stroke of Insight that is extremely approachable and very short and a wonderful read that provides insight into an extreme version of what happens when you experience a left hemisphere stroke. And in her particular case, I recall this from having read the book years ago. I believe she was on an elliptical machine or something analogous. And she talked about one of the immediate things that she began to experience, not having known yet that she experienced a stroke. She kind of came to that realization in the course of, which is actually also insightful to think about, right? That she was able to understand what was happening to her, which speaks to the extent of her cognitive faculties at the time. She talked about, if I remember correctly, she was, holding her hands on the levers of this elliptical machine, and she began to lose the distinction between her body parts, and everything began to increasingly be one sort of flowy experience, which sounds very much like the way that people describe their experience on psychedelics, which is that boundaries begin to melt and things begin to flow and lines begin to become extended, et cetera. What I also find interesting is the experience of people with right hemisphere deficits, because you were just talking about that a bit. And you said that this is what we tend to find in schizophrenic patients.
Yes.
And one of the things I find interesting, and I'd love for you to speak to it a bit, is, you kind of spoke to it earlier. You may have said this, which is that when people have right hemisphere deficits and they're more dominant in the left side of their brain, one of the things that happens is they become overly reliant on models. This is something that our listeners are really going to appreciate, because one of the areas, many of the subjects that we cover, or many of the topics that we cover, are economic in nature. We also actually recently did an episode on geopolitics with Jonathan Kirshner, where we talked about the over-reliance on deterministic models in the theoretical construction of realism, of structural realism in international relations. And we've spent decades, especially since World War II, refining and building these models of the world so that we can act on the world more efficiently and project power. And one of the things that we've discovered, one classic area where we've seen this has been in the economics profession because of the 2008 financial crisis, is that many of the models that we have used to understand the world are, again, they're just that. They're models, they're maps. They're not complete. They aren't the territory. And the assumptions that we make about the world determine how accurate those models are as a representation of the world. And what I find so interesting, to bring it back to individuals with right hemisphere deficits, is that they're using these explicit models of the world to act on the world. And this brings us to something you talked about earlier, which is this implicit versus explicit. And it also reminds me of the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein and the problem of trying to formalize into propositions the world that we experience, and how that in its own ways is responsible for the paradoxes that we experience. What are some of the more explicit aberrations that we would tend to see in individuals with right hemisphere deficits? Because one of the things I want to accomplish in doing this is, because there are so many ways in which this manifests, I want to give people a redundant sense of what this looks like so that they can really intuit it. So I'll just say this, there are one perfect example that I'm thinking of is the fact that someone with a right hemisphere deficit who maybe is not cognizant of the placement of his or her arm, when you point out that they can't move their arm, they say, no, it's not my arm, it's someone else's arm. In other words, they're so wedded to the model that they deny reality when faced with it.
100%, yes. The capacity for the left hemisphere to be in denial is quite extraordinary. And as you say, people will outright deny that they've got a paralyzed limb. And they will say that it belongs to the doctor, or it belongs to somebody in another part of the room, or it belongs to their mother or something like that. But rather than admit that their theory that everything is fine with them, and the left hemisphere tends to be an eternal optimist. Not in a good way. It can't accept that there might be danger and you need to do something now. It's always kind of, it's fine. We've got it under control. We can do a few tweaks. It'll all be utterly fine. Now, you just see. It has a very high opinion of itself and of its own capacities. And in fact, it's much less intelligent than the right hemisphere. And I mean intelligent in that cognitive intelligent sense, as well as emotional and social intelligence. So in fact, most of what is measured by an IQ test is things that are done by the right hemisphere, not by the left. And damage to the right hemisphere impairs the IQ more than damage to the left. So it's less intelligent. And there's a phenomenon in psychology called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which you may have come across, which basically means that the less somebody knows, the more convinced they are that they know it all. And the more people know, the less they feel that they can know it all. So we're in a difficult position with such a person because they're absolutely adamant that they've got it right. And they are wedded to their particular model. And they think the model is more real than anything from experience. So some way of putting this would be the triumph of theory over experience. And one of the difficulties with the modern world is that we have created a world around us that we experience, which is more and more like the sort of world the left hemisphere would create. Rectilinear, inflexible, concrete and steel, not living. And when you look out of the window to see the world, that the right hemisphere would say, but look at this. It's not like your model at all. You see something that is very like what the left hemisphere would model, because we've projected the left hemisphere's idea of the world a grid-like theoretical version of reality out there onto the world. And much of the debates that I hear going on in social media and in politics that often seem so completely weird boil down to the denial of experience in the face of an overwhelming theory. Whereas the point about theory is that the theory should be tested against empirical evidence. And if it doesn't measure up to the evidence, then it needs to go. So that's where we're at. And so now we find, Nobel Prizes given to economists to stop, because they've got a model which means that the economies, the Western economies won't crash again. And then, 1 or 2 years later, 2008-9, the economy crashed. There's a lovely experiment which is worth talking about where the subjects were asked to address a logical problem, a syllogism, in 3 conditions. One was the left hemisphere only, one was the right hemisphere only, and the other was with the whole brain intact. And these syllogisms had a falsehood in them. So the Hawaiian Islands are tropical. In tropical islands, the winter is cold. The winter is cold in Hawaii. Correct or not correct? And when the whole person is asked this, they say, but winters in tropical countries are not cold. So, of course, it's wrong. And when the right hemisphere is asked, it says the same thing. But when the left hemisphere is asked of the same person, this is not aggregated data, this is the very same person on another day addressing the same problem, they answer, yes, it's correct. And then they say, the experimenter says, but don't you know, in tropical countries, the winters are not cold? Yeah, I do know that. Well, why do you say it's correct? Because that's what it says on this piece of paper. Now, that is fascinating, because in the world of medicine where I work, I've retired now, but increasingly what was written on a piece of paper seemed to be more important and more true than the actual real experience of what happened to this particular patient. And we see it everywhere now around us.
That also kind of reminds me of this story that I had read. I think this was in James Glake's book, The Information, which I've cited before. And they asked pre-literate societies, they created a logical construction about bears in the north, right, yes, where all bears are, right. Yeah, and they couldn't follow the logic.
That's right.
Why don't you tell our listeners what I'm referring to so they also know?
Yes, well, that's a different thing, but that was actually work done by the very great Russian neurologist Alexander Luria. And he asked people in what was then the eastern part of the Soviet Union about the color of bears. And what he said is, in countries where there is a lot of snow and ice, the bears are white. In Greenland, or in Siberia, there is a lot of snow and ice. What color are the bears? And they would say, well, I can't answer that question because I've never been there. The only bears I've ever seen are brown bears. And he said, yeah, but look, if they are white when it's somewhere very, very cold like that, where there's snow and ice, then what color are they? And they said, no, I can't answer that question. If somebody very old came to me and said, and they'd been there and they'd been experienced, and they said there are white bears there, I believe them. In other words, they were completely empirical. And this is a very sane way to live, actually, for those people, to believe the evidence of experience, not some story that they have no way of evaluating.
I'm curious why it is that the left hemisphere seems to be, it's not just dealing more with abstractions, but it seems to exhibit a level of certainty around the models that it's come to the world with, and it's impervious to new information if it's contradictory. What
Absolutely.
Explains that?
Well, I think it's because it is evolutionarily developed to make snap decisions and to stick to them. Because if you're going to be a good hunter, or even just to pick up something quickly, you don't want to be entering into a sort of Hamlet-like debate. Well, is that a rabbit or is it not? It might not be. Maybe you've just got to go, it's a rabbit, I'm going to get it. So it has to be quick and dirty. And one of the things that I get is people who've read Kahneman's book on thinking fast, thinking slow. where he talks about two systems. And system one is quick and dirty and efficient for certain things. But system two is more thought through and complex. And people say to me, so system one, the quick and dirty one, is the right hemisphere, isn't it? And the other one, the thoughtful one, is the left hemisphere. No, it's the exact opposite. The left hemisphere is the quick and dirty one that jumps to conclusions. The reason why it's so associated with delusional thinking and delusional perception is because it jumps to conclusions. And the right hemisphere is what V.S. Ramachandran, a very great neuroscientist that you may have heard of, says, is the right hemisphere is the devil's advocate. In other words, it's the one that's going, yeah, you think that, but it might not be. We've got to bear in mind that this could not be the case. And the right hemisphere is able to hold open two options. There's a famous picture of the so-called duck rabbit. It's an illusion. If you look at it one way, it looks like a duck. In another way, it looks like a rabbit. Wittgenstein talked about it. Well, the right hemisphere is perfectly well able to say, well, it could be either a duck or a rabbit, depending on how you look at it. But the left hemisphere is going, what do you mean? Either it's a duck or it's a rabbit. It can't be both. And so it is very black and white, exclusionary and simple in its thinking. It really reduces cognition to the most basic level. And it's hilarious that people have believed that this left hemisphere thinking is intelligent and we ought to emulate it. There's a massive evidence that we do much better if we take into account a whole lot of different kinds of evidence. And we can only usefully do that if we also use our intuitions. So then we come to the question you asked earlier, maybe that's where you're going. How do we know anything at all?
Absolutely. And that's actually where we're going to go in the second hour. Before we do that, I have one more question that came to mind when I was reading your book, which is that the distinctions that we're talking about today, and also I do want to emphasize, people don't need to buy into your theory about the physiology or the physiological differences to find value in the metaphorical differences that we're talking about today, which I think we see everywhere around us. But one of the distinctions that came to my mind in the course of reading your work is that between the analog and the digital. Because the digital world is very discrete. It's symbol-oriented, and the analog world is continuous. Yeah. Is there some correlation here? In other words, is this digital world that we're building by its very nature more left-brained?
I think that's right, but I'd like to first just make a brief comment about people don't need to buy into it. I mean, goodness, the evidence is overwhelming. I really would like anyone who's read the first part of The Matter with Things to explain to me where I've made a mistake in that. And nobody in the world of neurology or neuroscience has been able to explain that the evidence is not substantial. So that's all I'd say. And I was stupid enough at the end of the earlier book, The Master and His Emissary, to say, if it should happen, and I think it's very unlikely that what I've said, it just doesn't stand up, then at least it's a very important metaphor. And people picked me up on that as though I'd said the science doesn't matter. I wouldn't have spent 30 years of a career on the science if I didn't actually think it mattered. And I've been quite meticulous in that. I just wanted to point that out because I think it helps explain why everyone everywhere in the world has myths that relate to these two kinds of thinking in the brain, which really you couldn't have known prior to the 1960s. Such a wealth of information about hemisphere differences are sometimes contained in those myths. They were ahead of what people were suggesting in the period of pop psychology of hemisphere difference in the 60s and 70s. They'd already got there hundreds of years ago. So anyway, the digital thing is interesting because, of course, it is the exact equivalent of breaking up a picture into tiny little bits of information and losing the connectivity of the whole. And there's something about a sweeping line or an outline that means that it is a single, unified, organic whole. I personally don't think that the levels at which ears work, I know there are people who say, oh, you know, the old LPs were so much better than a CD. I have to say, I think the sound that comes from a CD is exquisite, and you don't have the problem of clunks on your LP and having to suddenly get up and change it over. But anyway, that's aside. What's really important is the way in which this digital knowledge, this imperfect knowledge, because it's only an approximation by lots of little bits, plays into something that's now happening, which is the emergence of these rather sophisticated bots like ChatGPT, which give a digital rendering of the world. And what they do is, there's a writer called Ted Chiang who has written a piece about this in the New Yorker, I think it is, and it's very well worth reading. What he basically points out is that in the past, photocopiers simply photocopied an image in a sort of analog way. But now they do it through digitalization of the image. And it turns out that what they print sometimes contains enormous discrepancies, because an algorithm has worked on the data and filled in the gaps in ways that make sense to the algorithm, but actually don't represent what was on that original sheet. So the photocopier is no longer identical with the original. Now, that's just an image. But if you take it to something that is trying to answer a question about what happens when, what do you think about, it will search the internet, and most of what it says will be not fully represented, but lossy. It will have loss of data in it, and it will fill in the data with things that to it look like they would fit in those gaps. And that then becomes truth. It reports figures, events that don't exist. So this is really, really critical point. Thank you for raising it.
Yeah.